Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was born May 19, 1870. On January 16, 1936, he died. He was an American serial killer. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogeyman. He was a child rapist and cannibal. He boasted that he had children in every state, and at one time stated the number was about 100. However, it is not known whether he was referring to rapes or cannibalization, nor is it known if the statement was truthful. He was a suspect in at least 5 murders during his lifetime. Fish confessed to 3 murders that the police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. He was put on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd. He was convicted and executed by electric chair. He was born in Washington, D.C. to Randall and Ellen Fish. His father was an American of English ancestry and his mother was Scottish-Irish American. Fish was born to Randall and Ellen Fish. His father was American of English ancestry and his mother was a Scot-Irish American. Fish said that he was named after the statesman and politician Hamilton Fish, a distant relative. His father was 43 years older than his mother. He was 75 years old at the time of his birth. Fish was the youngest child and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. He wished to be known as Albert after a dead sibling, and to avoid the nickname of Ham and Eggs that he was given at an orphanage in which he spent most of his childhood. Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. A brother was confined in a state mental hospital. His sister was diagnosed with mental affliction. 3 of the relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had oral and visual hallucinations. His father was a riverboat captain, and by 1870 was a fertilizer manufacturer. The elder Fish died in 1875 at the 6th Street station of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He died of a heart attack. The Congressional Cemetery records show that Randall died on October 16, 1875, and was buried October 19, 1875. Fish's mother put her son into St. John's Orphanage in Washington, where he was frequently treated sadistically. He began to enjoy the physical pain that the beatings brought. Of his time in the orphanage, Fish remarked, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." By 1880, his mother had a government job and was able to remove Fish from the orphanage. In 1882, at age 12, he began a relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as drinking urine and eating feces. Fish began visiting public baths where he would watch other boys undress and spend a great portion of his weekends on these visits. Throughout his life, he would write obscene letters to women whose names he acquired from classified advertising and matrimonial agencies. By 1890, Fish arrived in New York City, and he said that at that point he became a prostitute and began raping young boys. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him with a woman 9 years his junior. They had 6 children: Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. Throughout 1898, he worked as a house painter. He said he continued molesting children, mostly boys younger than age 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum where Fish was fascinated by the bisection of a penis. After that, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. In 1903, he was arrested for grand larceny and was sentenced to incarceration in Sing Sing. Around 1910, while he was working in Wilmington, Delaware, Fish met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. He took Kedden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It is unclear whether or not Fish forced Kedden to do these things, but in his confession he implies the man was intellectually disabled. After 10 days, Fish took Kedden to an old farmhouse where he began to torture him. The torture took place over 2 weeks. Fish eventually tied Kedden up and cut off half of his penis. I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me. He originally intended to kill Kedden, cut up his body and take it home, but he feared the hot weather would draw attention to him. Instead, Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in Vaseline-covered handkerchief, and left a $10 bill. He kissed Kedden goodbye and left. I took the first train I could back home, never heard what became of him, or tried to find out. In January 1917, Fish's wife left him for John Straub, a handyman who boarded with the Fish family. Fish then had to raise his children as a single parent. After his arrest, Fish told the newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. He began to have auditory hallucinations. He once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. It was about that time that Fish began to indulge in self-harm. He would embed needles into his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, x-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged into his pelvic region. He also would hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and insert wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it alight. While he was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his children, he did encourage them and their friends to paddle his buttocks with the same nail-studded paddle that he used to abuse himself. He soon developed a growing obsession with cannibalism, often preparing himself a dinner consisting solely of raw meat and sometimes serving it to his children. In about 1919, he stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Fish chose people who were either mentally handicapped or African American as his victims, explaining that he assumed these people would not be missed when killed. Fish tortured, mutilated, and murdered young children with his implements of hell, a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. On July 11, 1924, Fish found an 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing alone on her parents' Staten Island farm. He offered her money to come help him look for rhubarb. She was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Fish away. Fish left but returned later to the Keel's barn where he tried to sleep but was discovered by Hans Keel and forced to leave. During 1924, the 54-year-old Fish, suffering from psychosis, felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. Shortly before his abduction of Grace Budd, Fish attempted to test his implements of hell on a child he had been molesting named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friend were playing boxball on a sidewalk when Fish asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they said they had not, he invited them to his apartment for sandwiches. While the two boys were wrestling on Fish's bed, they dislodged his mattress. Underneath was a knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver. They became frightened and ran out of his apartment. Fish remarried on February 6, 1930, in Waterloo, New York, to Estella Wilcox, but divorced after only 1 week. Fish was arrested in May 1930 for sending an obscene letter to a woman who answered an advertisement for a maid. Following that arrest and one in 1931, he was sent to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation. On May 25, 1928, Fish saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." On May 28, 1928, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretense of hiring Edward. He later confessed that he planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. Fish promised to hire Budd and his friend Willie, and said that he would send for them in a few days. He failed to show up, but sent a telegraph to the Budd family apologizing and set a later date. When Fish returned, he met Grace Budd. He apparently changed his intended victim from Edward Budd to Grace Budd and quickly made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party. He convinced the parents, Delia Flanagan and Albert Budd first, to let Grace accompany him to the party that evening. The elder Albert Budd was a porter from the United States Equitable Life Assurance Society. Grace had a younger sister, Beatrice, 2 older brothers, Edward and George Budd, and a younger brother, Albert Budd II. Grace left with Fish that day, but never returned. The police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope on September 5, 1930, as a suspect accused by the Pope's estranged wife. He spent 108 days in jail between his arrest and a trial December 22, 1930. He was found not guilty. In November 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to the girl's parents, which ultimately led the police to Fish. Mrs. Budd was illiterate and could not read the letter herself, so she had her son read it to her. The unaltered letter reads this: "My dear Mrs. Budd, In 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of a naked body, boy or girl, would be brought out and just what you want cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys. One was 7 and one was 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet. Then he burned everything they had on. Several times a day and night he spanked them, tortured them to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time I was living on 409 E 100 Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 W 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have if I wished. She died a virgin. Police investigated the letter. The story concerning Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong could not be verified. The part of the letter concerning the murder of Grace Budd, however, was found to be inaccurate in its description of the kidnapping and subsequent events, although it was impossible to confirm whether or not Fish had actually eaten parts of Grace's body. The letter was delivered in an envelope that had a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NYPCBA, representing the New York's Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor at the company told the police he had taken some of the stationery home but left it at his rooming house in 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. The landlady of the rooming house said that Fish was checked out of that room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him some money and asked her to hold his check for him. William F. King was the chief investigator for the case. He waited outside the room until Fish returned. Fish agreed to go to headquarters for questioning. He then pulled out a razor blade. King disarmed Fish and took him to police headquarters. Fish made no attempt to deny the murder of Grace Budd, saying that he meant to go to the house to kill Edward Budd, Grace's brother. Fish said that it never even entered his head to rape the girl, but he later claimed to his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. This information was used at trial to make the claim that the kidnapping was sexually motivated, thus avoiding any mention of cannibalism. Other crimes discovered after Fish's arrest include Francis McDonald and Billy Gaffney. During the night of July 14, 1924, 9-year-old Francis McDonald was reported missing by his parents. He failed to return home after playing catch with his friend in the Port Richmond neighborhood of Staten Island. A search was organized and his body was found hung by a tree in a wooded area near his home. He had been sexually assaulted, then strangled with his suspenders. According to an autopsy, McDonald had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen. and his left hamstring had almost entirely been stripped off its flesh. Fish refused to claim responsibility for this, although a neighbor also told the police he observed the boy with a similar-looking man walking along a grassy path into nearby woods. Francis's mother, Anna McDonald, said she saw the same man earlier that day. She told the reporters he came shuffling down the street mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick gray hair and his droopy gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray. This description resulted in the mysterious stranger becoming known as the Gray Man. The McDonald murder remained unsolved until the murder of Grace Budd, when several eyewitnesses among the Staten Island farmer Hans Keel positively identified Albert Fish as the odd stranger seen around Port Richmond on the day of Francis McDonald's disappearance. Richmond County District Attorney Thomas J. Walsh announced his intentions to seek the indictment against Fish for the boy's murder. At first, Fish denied the charges. It was only in March 1935, after the conclusion of his trial for the Budd murder and his confession to the killing of Billy Gaffney, that Fish confirmed the investigators that he also raped and murdered Francis McDonald. When the McDonald confession was made public, the New York Daily Mirror wrote the disclosure solidified Fish's reputation as the most vicious child slayer in criminal history. On February 11, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in an apartment hallway in Brooklyn with 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. When the 12-year-old left for his apartment, both younger boys disappeared. Beaton was later found on the roof of the apartments. When asked what happened to Gaffney, Beaton said the bogeyman took him. Gaffney's body was never recovered. Initially, serial killer Peter Kudzowski was a suspect in the boys' murder. Then, Joseph Meehan, a motorman on the Brooklyn trolley, saw a picture of Fish in the newspaper and identified him as the old man whom he saw February 11, 1927. The old man had been trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket, was crying for his mother, and was dragged by the man on and off the trolley. Beaton's description of the bogeyman matched Fish. Police matched the description of the child to Billy Gaffney. Detectives of the Manhattan Missing Persons Bureau were able to establish that Fish was employed as a house painter by a Brooklyn real estate company during February 1927, and on the day of Billy Gaffney's disappearance, he was working at a location a few miles away from where the boy was abducted. Fish claimed the following in a letter to his attorney. I brought him to Riker Ave Dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump, and I walked back and took a trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat of nine tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, split these half in 6 strips, about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to it and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had grip with me. I put his nose and ears and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below his belly button, then through his legs about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. I put this in sacks weighted with stones, tied the ends and threw them into pools of slimy water you will see along the road going to North Beach. The water's 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best, his monkey and peewees, and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, and pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnip, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when the meat had roasted about a fourth of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for the gravy and put it in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that had tasted half as good as the sweet fat behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his BBs I could not chew. I threw them in the toilet. Elizabeth Gaffney visited Fish in Sing Sing, accompanied by Detective King and 2 other men. She wanted to ask him about her son's death, but Fish refused to speak to her. Fish began to weep and asked to be left alone. After 2 hours of questions through his lawyer, James Dempsey, Mrs. Gaffney gave up. She was still unconvinced that Albert Fish was her son's killer.